All right, guys, welcome aboard. We are back for the weekly Mac Forum video chat. Hope you are prepared. We have a decent amount of information for you this evening. This is the February 21st, 2016 video chat. Video will be back next week, I promise. We got that worked out right before the show, but my little corner of the broadcast bunker is a mess because of some other experiments I've been conducting. So we'll take care of that and be back in video format next week. In the meantime, let's get right into everything. First of all, I want to welcome our newest member. I'm just going to spell this one because I know I'll mispronounce it. It's Gdejaynes. So, welcome to them and to all of our new members. I hope that you are enjoying your tenure in the forum. If you are one of these folks that has just been lurking around, keep in mind that in order to post a question, you need to be able to go ahead and register. Registration is free, it doesn't cost you anything. And the main reason is that if you post in the Contact Us forum, which is an area that some of our unregistered users, people who are lurking, post questions, the only people that see that question is the small number of members that are in the moderation team, and they may or may not have the answer to your question. So you want to be able to go ahead and register so that you can post it and open it up to a wider variety of the membership. We have a lot of knowledgeable members, and it's a good possibility that some of them will have um, an answer to your question. Coming up this evening, as usual, we have our forum roundup, a few iOS tips this week, a iTunes tip or two from Kirk, the iTunes guy, McLaren. Uh, I'll have links to all of this information at the end in the show notes. Those will get posted sometime this evening. They'll certainly be up by tomorrow morning. All right, let's get right into things. One of the things that I want to go ahead and try to tackle, both the forum news and some Mac news before we get into the tips and tricks. We'll kind of end up with the tips and tricks this evening. As far as the forum, uh, we have the usual array of threads and tips that's been getting a lot of traffic this week. One of them has to do with um, a court order requesting that Apple um, uh, unlock, if you will, or decrypt a phone that I believe was found with one of the San Bernardino terrorists. Now there's been a lot of reporting about this all over the place, and some of the national news has done a better job of reporting this than others. One of the problems with the reporting has been they did not point out that in the initial order, Apple did not have an opportunity to challenge the order in court. Officially, Apple has said they're not going to do this. They have some security concerns as it goes forward, uh, as far as future users are concerned, and the possibility that this would be abused and were it to get out would lead to some other security issues. As you can tell, opinions about this have been all over the place. Some people basically have said, well, it's in the interest of security. Go ahead and do it. We don't have a problem with it. It's in the interest of security. Do it. Others have said, wait a minute. Uh, we don't think that's the right approach because you're essentially assuming that something's on there that it might not be. And how long would it be before this is broadened to include other things that have nothing to do with terrorism? What's the possibility that this procedure or process would be abused in the future, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? The thread in the forum has some interesting comments and interesting things to look at. I'll link to that as usual, and that'll get you an idea of what the forum is thinking. Um, as I say, we'll kind of keep following this. I think it's one that as users we need to keep an eye on because we have a stake in how this is resolved, one way or the other. You know, a lot of people seem to assume that, well, if you aren't doing anything wrong, why do you have a problem with somebody looking at what's on your phone? I'm not sure I like that kind of logic. You know, there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily wrong, but aren't necessarily someone else's business either. So this is something that's interesting to puzzle at and wonder about. And as users, we're going to have a stake in whatever the outcome is. So I encourage you to keep an eye on this and decide for yourself. Another thread that I wanted to mention, just because we've seen a wealth of threads like this in recent weeks, has to do with member C.W. Glover posted a question about a problem they were having with a Canon wireless printer not seeing their iMac, not being able to print from the iMac, and they are running um, the current OS with a Canon printer, and they were able to print wirelessly at some point, and then kind of lost that ability. The printer couldn't be found on the network. There were a number of suggestions tried, including resetting the printing system. The directions for that are in the thread. But among other things, and he had already tried that. That did not seem to work. Resetting the printing system didn't cure it. Uh, Reloading the printer by going into printers and scanners preference did not seem to fix the problem either. In other words, deleting it from printers and scanners and reloading didn't seem to fix the problem. Um, and member C.W. Glover pointed out that they found a solution to the problem that didn't involve resetting the printing system. And that's one of the reasons I posted this thread. They found that uh, the solution on their own based on some comments that were made in the thread. And their solution was power down the printer, the iMac, all the gizmos associated with the wireless network, reset the router, which basically in most routers, that's going to mean the easy way to do it is to pull the plug for a few minutes, a minute or so for most routers, plug it back in, let it reboot, uh, and then gradually bring the other gear online, the printers and the other devices. And all of a sudden, things kind of sorted themselves out. If you try this technique, do remember that when you reboot the router, whether you do it by going into the administration page on the router and choosing reboot, or whether you do it by pulling the power on it, it's going to take it anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute or more to reboot. Most routers will take no more than a couple of minutes. Make sure that that router has completely rebooted, and you can usually tell by the lights. Varies slightly from modem to modem, but you can usually tell by the lights. Make sure that the router has rebooted, then boot uh, the printer and then the other devices. If you boot the printer before the router has completely rebooted, what's going to happen is you're essentially in the same situation. The printer may or may not see the network. So that's a good tip. I wanted to pass that on. I've had to use something similar with my Canon printer on a couple of occasions. Uh, I know there are a number of our forum members who've had some issues with Canon printers, but this is not a problem that's unique to Canons. I've had a number of instances from with friends and other people that I've known, people that I know from the forum, who essentially have the same problem. We had that problem with a brother laser printer at one point uh, that would periodically just lose all connection with the network, and we'd not be able to print. So that's a good one to keep in mind and keep handy. This week, I was checking out Kirk the iTunes guy over as usual with his Macworld column. As you know, I'm a regular reader of Kirk's site, and when I find an interesting something, then I go to his Macworld article to check it out further. One of the things that he mentions this week is a possible bug in iTunes 12.3. I had not experienced this problem, but I have separate playlists. I don't have them nested inside of a folder. If you have uh, iTunes playlists organized in folders, so let's say you've got a bunch of folders, a bunch of playlists rather that start with the letter A, and you've got them in a folder that says A. Anytime you change or edit a playlist, you've got them already in a certain order. You got the playlist all in order the way you want them, and you go into one of those playlists and edit it. You make some kind of change. You add a song, remove a song, anything of that nature. That will sometimes cause that playlist to move out of order and go down to the bottom of the list uh, in the playlist or in that folder. Uh, and this can happen anytime you do any kind of editing with the playlist. You change a playlist view, for example. Uh, Playlists that are not in folders do not seem to have this problem. So if you've just got separate playlists like I do and they're not in a folder, you probably haven't experienced this bug. But when you put your playlists in folders, then you encounter this problem, and it can be, I would imagine, rather annoying. Okay. And the solution for now is simply to quit iTunes and relaunch it. And apparently, in most cases, the playlist comes back in order the way it should be. This is probably a bug in 12.3, and it wouldn't surprise me if you didn't see a fix in a subsequent iTunes update. In that same column, Kirk has a tip for what to do if you want a song to appear more than once to be repeated in a playlist. Maybe, for example, you've got a workout playlist and you have a certain song that you want in that playlist multiple times. Shuffling, etc., isn't going to accomplish that. When I read this tip, I must admit, my brain, I did a Homer Simpson moment thing there, complete face palm, and thought to myself, why didn't I think of that? The simplest fix, let's assume it's a regular playlist, it's not a smart playlist. The simplest fix is to simply have that song in the playlist multiple times, even if it's the same song. Just drag the song from the main library list over to the playlist you want it in. And if you want it in the playlist 3 times, drag it into the playlist 3 times. You're not making 3 copies of the song because what you're doing is manipulating the pointers that iTunes uses to tell it where in the world those songs are. So if you had a playlist of, say, workout music and you wanted to include, say, for example, Tom Sawyer from Rush, and you want it 3 times in the playlist, go find it in your main library, create your playlist as you normally would, and then in the process of creating the playlist, drag that song in 3 times and put it wherever you want in the playlist. And that should work. in most cases. Uh, there are some other um, tips. Of course, Kirk has a lot of other tips. I encourage you to check out his site. There are lots of other uh, tips about audio in general, about iTunes, about the Mac, and sometimes things that are off topic. He has a wide range of interest. Another thing that I'm finding myself reading this week is in the past, I've read a little bit of Johnny Evans at Appleholics. That's a site that I've read in the past. He has a Google Plus group, uh, and I've read some of his postings in the past. And this time, I stumbled on something where he has 9 iOS tips that many users may not be aware of. Some of them, I will admit, several of them I was not aware of simply because I don't always do some of the things that were involved in that playlist, in that list of tips. Let me give you an idea of some of them, for example. Let's say that you're surfing the web on your iDevice, on your iPhone, on your iPad, and for whatever reason, you want to request the desktop version of a site. More and more websites now have both a desktop version and a mobile version. And if you wanted to request the desktop version of a site, what you simply do, one shortcut to doing that is to tap and hold down the reload button that's in the URL bar, and then tap the request desktop site command that pops up. You can also do this through the sharing menu, if I remember correctly, but this eliminates a step or so. Another one of the things that I've liked about recent versions of Safari is that I have a tendency to surf the web with tabs, and I'll click a link, pop that link open in a tab, and sometimes when I misclick, instead of opening a new tab, when I'm done reading that tab, then I generally close it. And occasionally, I'll misclick and just send it straight through in the same window I'm already in. And then I close that. Well, now I've closed a window that I probably wanted open. And by using Command Z in the desktop version of Safari, it'll reopen whatever I just closed. So here's a quick way to do that on iOS devices. You can access Safari's list of recently closed tabs by tapping the two squares at the bottom right of the Safari window to open the tab carousel view. That's the view that puts web pages in like a flip page mode where you can kind of thumb through them. And then tap and hold the plus symbol at the bottom of that, and you'll see the recently closed tab screen. That's a good way to go after it if you can remember that tip. Another tip that Johnny has is about using shared reminders. This is a great idea if you're working on a project with a group of people and you all use iPhones, iOS devices, etc. Um, if you're making use of shared lists, if you've ever done that where you can share a list with iOS users, this is similar. It lets friends, family, colleagues use the iOS reminder app to create shared reminders. Okay, and you can create one of these by opening the reminder tab and create a new list and add items to it just the way you normally would. Okay, name it in the usual way. And then when you get to the generic reminder view listing all your notes, select the new one, tap edit, and then select sharing. And you should be able to add the emails of the contacts that you want to share the list with. You can add others using the add person command. And now everyone in the group can share and add new items or mark off completed items on the list. This would be a good way, it seems to me, to remind everyone about an upcoming meeting all at once without having to worry about, oh, did I forget to email this person, forget to email that person? Most of us have our iPhones and iDevices with us, and that's a good um, way to do that. I have not tried this one personally. When I read this, I thought, well, hey, that is a brilliant idea. Why didn't I think of doing that? Sometimes when I see some of these tips, that's what occurs to me is, boy, that's a brilliant idea. Why didn't I think of that? Uh, Another set of things that comes from Johnny Evans over at Appleaholic, as you can see, spent a lot of time reading through this one in the last 2 or 3 days or over this weekend, and with good reason. He has quite a few tips related to mail in the iOS. Things like creating and saving attachments, shortcuts for sending attachments, a 3D touch tip if you've got one of the devices that supports 3D touch. Notify, which is a tip that he uses quite a bit. When he sends or receives an email about an urgent topic, he wanted a way to monitor that, and he can use the notify me function, which pops up a notification on his lock screen when a message comes in concerning that important piece of email. Okay. And what that does is that gives him an option. If he has received an email, he can tap and hold on the flag button at the bottom left of the screen and choose notify me to create that. And when creating urgent uh, emails, he activates notify me by tapping the bell at the right hand side of the subject line. I hadn't, to be honest with you, I hadn't even noticed that bell was there most of the time. Most of the email that I send from home, I send from the Mac, and it gets mirrored over to the iDevice. So I don't write a lot of email on my iOS devices. Although there are times, I mean, it goes kind of in fits and spurts with me. And usually I'm responding to individual things, or I'm clicking on a link to read something that's been posted in the forum or something of that nature. So I'm not what you would call an iOS power user in most cases. The iDevices are convenience. I'm still learning new tips and tricks every time they come out with the new OS or a refinement of something. I think to myself, boy, I didn't know that. How did I miss that? Or there's some new feature or a refinement of a feature. And I think, how in the world did I miss that? So that's an idea of some of the things that you can find over at Appleaholics. It's turning out to be an interesting group. A couple of other things caught my attention uh, this week. One of them was the over at Cult of Mac in their how to section. Of course, they have some info on the um, on this dust up that Apple has with the courts over creating and unlocking that iPhone, but also in their how-to section, they have an article, a brief article. It's very well written about podcasting and getting yourself set up to do podcasting on a minimal budget. I mean, obviously, you could spend a significant amount of money uh, to do this, but most of us, I think, are working on a tight budget, and this kind of addresses that. And they mentioned that there's kind of been a little bit of a renaissance there of podcasting recently. At one point when podcasting first started, there were lots of new things popping up all the time, and then it kind of backed off a little bit, and now it seems to be making a little bit of a comeback. The interesting thing about podcasting to me is it's the next logical step. It's always seemed to me to be the next logical step in broadcasting. Let me give you an idea of what I mean. In when I was in high school, I took a course in radio broadcasting, and one of the things came that I noticed later on is seems to have gone in phases. I mean, for example, initially you had radio and TV predominantly dominated, particularly on the TV side, in the state side anyway, by the three big networks: NBC, ABC, CBS. And then along comes the advent of cable, and gradually you saw more channels developing. And over time, you saw channels that were aimed at certain groups or predominantly aimed at certain groups. Just as an example, BET, which predominantly geared toward African Americans, although certainly they were open to anyone watching. Then you had other things like Home Shopping Network, for example, or the History Channel. There are tons of these things out there, uh, networks out there. Uh, and when the digital broadcast boom started, people were suggesting that it would make possible to have 500 channels. Well, even with that many channels, it takes a significant investment to create a broadcast, whether it be radio or television. It takes a significant investment of time and money to do that. You got to have studio, you got to have studio time, all of these things. When podcasting came along, that to me is, um, and I think the cable thing I would almost refer to as narrow casting. Whereas with the initial broadcast, ABC, NBC, CBS, you do a broadcast, you try to gear it toward the widest possible audience. With the advent of cable, particularly the proliferation of specialty channels, you had what you might refer to some extent as narrowcasting. In other words, now you see channels that are devoted to people who are history buffs or devoted to certain groups of people. Or if you're a cooking, if cooking is your thing, there are channels now that are devoted to that. In some cases, for certain topics, multiple channels. At one time, there was a show there was an entire network called Tech TV oriented toward technology. But here's where the rub comes in. If you were a Mac user, for example, when Tech TV was around, sometimes you'd watch all day for a little bit of Mac related news. Okay. It was geared predominantly toward PC and predominantly toward other technologies. It was a good network, but it just had a dearth of Mac information. And then along comes podcasting. And now um, you can have what I sometimes refer to when talking about this with friends, I sometimes refer to it as microcasting. You can have a podcast uh, using basically equipment that you already have if you have a Mac and GarageBand and do a decent production and upload that somewhere, and you may only have a handful of listeners because the podcast is so specialized. Um, if you're a fan of Big Bang Theory, for example, you know that those of you who are fans of the show know that Sheldon is supposed to do a show that he refers to as fun with flags, and his objective is to import flag knowledge. Well, I don't know how many people are interested in that, but you can do that with a podcast. You can do something like that with a podcast. At one point, there were a couple of podcasts devoted to uh, Apple's Automator program. There's a podcast, a very well done podcast that I used to listen to quite regularly about automating things on the Mac. There are several Mac related podcasts now. So you don't need a huge budget. And this article from Cult of Mac gives you some ideas about what you can do on a relatively low budget. I think one of the suggestions they used, the total, assuming you already had the Mac, was around $300 and could have been done with less. They assumed that you were going to make a step up from the internal microphones that are included with most Macs now, and they mentioned one or two other things. But certainly, it's written at a level that it's accessible to anyone. It doesn't take a lot of prior knowledge about recording, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I'm using essentially my iMac and a Mac a microphone rather, that I purchased from a friend of mine a few years ago. Um, he let me have the mic for quite a bit less than it would have sold for retail. I did get a mixing board, a cheap one, simply because that uh, microphone doesn't plug directly into the Mac. There's no good way to do that. But you can certainly set yourself up to do a podcast on a reasonable budget. And if you take your time, if you're interested in that, if you take your time, you can upgrade gradually as your needs change. Uh, GarageBand has some interesting features that can be a help before you invest in a ton of software to do it. Learn the software that you have and see if it will meet your needs. A lot of times it will, particularly in the beginning. As you get more experience, you may want more, but look initially at the advantages and disadvantages of using the software that's already on your system. All right, guys, that's going to just about do it for today. You heard me rant and rave a little bit about podcasting and this whole idea of microcasting and setting things up. Hopefully, you found some of that interesting. I'll have a link to that. That information is not in the show notes right now, but it will be when it goes up to the website. You can find that. Um, I'm going to post the link as usual underneath in the show, and then you can also that'll take you to the Mac Forum page, and it will have the summary complete with links to all of the relevant articles, and perhaps one or two other things that I occasionally throw in there as useful tidbits. Anyway, that's going to just about do it for this week. I hope that you enjoy the show. And until next week, this is your host, Sly Dude, and I will be seeing you on the forum. If you have a question or you have a comment or an idea for improving the show, be sure and post it in the Sunday chat thread, which you can find in the community announcement section of the forum. And until next week, enjoy your week, guys.